Hello again. In part 2 of chapter 19, I will go over some of the causes of the War of 1898, or the Spanish-American War as it's called in American history, and some of the major events. The Cubans had been revolting against the Spaniards more and more frequently in the late 19th century, and this became a concern to the United States because of the commercial and corporate interests that were present on the island. The United States did way more trading with Cuba than Spain did, and the owners of those plantations became concerned about their investments. And during what became the Cuban War for Independence during those years, 95,000 Cuban peasants died from wounds as well as disease and starvation in Spanish detention camps. And Americans were following this conflict because there is a huge circulation war going on in New York City, the largest city in the United States, between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Each strove to outdo the other with sensational headlines about every Spanish atrocity in Cuba, real or invented. And this came to be called yellow journalism. This is one of the causes of the War of 1898. It's a type of news reporting, and both Hearst and Pulitzer sent their best reporters down there to generate news, to exaggerate events, and then they would publicize this in an effort to increase their circulation. And this created mounting public sympathy for the rebel cause, and that caused concern in Congress. And by concurrent resolutions on April the 6th, 1896, the House and Senate endorsed granting official recognition to the Cuban rebels. And the Spaniards respond to all this. They offered the Cubans autonomy, self-government, but without formal independence in return for ending the rebellion. But the Cubans rejected the offer. And in early 1898, two events pushed Spain and the United States into war, and neither country really wanted this. The battleship Maine exploded in Havana on February the 15th, 1898, although a later investigation proved that this destruction was an accident. It was initially attributed by war-hungry Americans to the devilish Spaniards, those treacherous dogs, and this contributed as a major cause of the War of 1898. The second main immediate cause was the Delhomme letter. It was private correspondence written by the ambassador to the United States, Depoy Delhomme, that described President McKinley as being weak, and Cuban revolutionaries got a hold of this, and they gave it to the Hearst paper, and he published this. And this deepened American resentment of Spain. And this was the headline in the Hearst paper after Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. They offered $50,000 reward to find out who had caused this explosion. The criminals, they called them. This is, I believe, $1.4 million in today's dollars. Unbelievable amount of money. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt was convinced that this was no accident, as were the naval officers. Well, where were these naval officers in allowing these alleged Spaniards to set these charges, right? They were derelict in their duty if this actually happened then. And in the weeks following the sinking, the Spanish government again agreed to every major demand by the American government regarding its rule. But the weight of enraged public opinion, spurred on by Hearst and Pulitzer, and the influence of the jingoists like Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, pushed President McKinley away from neutrality. And on April 11th, President McKinley asked Congress for authority to use force to end the fighting there. And on April the 20th, Congress declared Cuba independent, and they demanded the withdrawal of Spanish forces. And then the Spanish government broke diplomatic ties, and after the blockade was set up, Spain declared war. The Congress then passed its own declaration of war on April 25th. And with the passage of the war declaration, attached to that was the Teller Amendment, which said that this war was strictly for Cuban independence, not to annex Cuba as a territory. The later Platt Amendment will rescind this, and it will declare Cuba a protectorate under the American sphere of influence, and that will intervene there if need be. And President McKinley, writing in his diary, said that while they're conducting the war, we need to keep everything that we get out of this. So, the war to free Cuba thus began a way to gain an empire on top of Alaska, which had been acquired by treaty and money, on top of the annexation of Hawaii against the Hawaiian wishes. Now, the Spanish-American War will further American interests in what will turn out to be the Pacific and Asia. And this is called the War of 1898, because it involves more than just the Spanish and Americans. It also involved Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans as well. This is the more accurate term in 2018. And out in the Philippines, where the Spanish had been for over 300 years, Roosevelt, while he was still Assistant Secretary, he resigned quickly because he wanted to get into this war. He wanted to be a soldier and he wanted to be a war hero. He greatly desired that. While he was still Secretary, he ordered Commodore Dewey to take the Asiatic Squadron to engage Spanish forces just in case war happened in that side of the world. And from a geopolitical point of view, Roosevelt was right in doing this because he knows the Germans and the French and the British are out there. They're lurking. And Dewey arrives on April 30th with modern ships, and they destroyed the outdated Spanish vessels. 400 Spaniards were killed. 1 American died of heat stroke because he's overweight. An English reporter called it an execution rather than a real contest. However lopsided the battle, this victory set off wild celebrations in the war-hungry United States. This was the first official conflict since the end of the Civil War. Now we have possession of Manila Bay, but he doesn't have any soldiers to go on shore. So he stayed there because, again, the British and the Germans are lurking, and they're going to seize these islands if the United States doesn't do so. This is a nice map of Dewey's fleet's travels from Hong Kong into Manila Bay, and they will get assistance from Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the leader of the Filipino nationalist movement, and he declared the Philippines independent from Spain on June the 12th. And with Aguinaldo's help, Dewey's forces entered Manila and took the surrender of the Spanish troops there because they didn't want to surrender to the Filipinos. And this is a nice map of the U.S. fleet surrounding the Cuban islands. And this shows where Roosevelt and the Rough Riders would take Kettle Hill. They were publicized exaggeratedly of taking the whole thing themselves, but black American troops actually took the main part of San Juan Hill. And there's a picture of Colonel Roosevelt, the commander of the Rough Rider Regiment. Most of those troops came from the southwest of the United States. There were also Ivy League athletes that joined up with this regiment, and this makes Roosevelt a war hero. On July the 3rd, the Spanish Navy tried to evade the blockade, and they were also outgunned because this American fleet had just been built in the 1890s. It is a very modern navy. Casualties were one-sided, and Spanish officials in Santiago surrendered on July 17th. On July 25th, an American force took control of Puerto Rico, meeting only minor resistance. The next day, on July 26th, the Spanish government sued for peace. A ceasefire agreement was signed on August 12th, just before Americans entered Manila. And in Cuba, the Spanish forces formally surrendered to the U.S. commander and then sailed for home. And the Cubans aren't even involved in this ceremony at all. On December the 10th, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the conflict. Under the terms of this treaty, Cuba was to become independent, and the United States was to annex Puerto Rico and to continue to occupy Manila, pending a transfer of power in the Philippines. And with the Treaty of Paris, the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which was initiated by the voyages of Christopher Columbus some 4 centuries earlier, came to a humiliating end. And now the United States is ready to create its own empire.